Welcome to the McDonough School and to Georgetown and to this conference today. Maybe this is a good time for all of us to turn off our cell phones or put them on vibrate. I'm Reena Agarwal. I'm the Robert Emmett McDonough Professor of Finance here at Georgetown and also the director of our Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy. We are absolutely delighted to once again partner with the Financial Times to bring this conference together. Georgetown and the McDonough School and the Center regularly partners with the Financial Times to host events, including this one. This is our third Financial Markets Quality Conference. And we have with us today Mike McKenzie from the FT. Mike is the U.S. Markets Editor for the Financial Times. And later this afternoon, Gina Chow, who is the U.S. Regulatory Correspondent. Gina will do a Q&A with Rick Ketchum from FINRA. So we are delighted to be partnering with FT once again on this event. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors and participants without whom we really couldn't have done this. So we are welcoming back and thrilled to welcome back the CME Group, BATS, ITG, Gabelli Funds, PwC, and this year we are also joined by PIMCO and BlackRock and Rosenblatt Securities as participating in the conference. So just a little bit about Georgetown University, for those of you who might not know. We are one of the world's leading academic and research institutions, offering a transformational educational experience for students that prepares the next generation of global citizens to lead and to make a difference in the world. Our mission here at the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy is to provide thought leadership for global finance. The center offers innovative, influential, and thoughtful commentary on all kinds of issues that are related to global finance. And we believe we can bring together market participants, policymakers, and add to that the rigor of academia to have a very fruitful discussion about ongoing issues in global finance, just like the one today. So through these activities, the center contributes to an informed public discussion regarding critical debates about global financial markets. We really believe it is the responsibility of Georgetown University to provide unbiased analysis that can guide both market participants and policymakers. So we host dialogues, conferences involving scholars, practitioners, and policymakers on different issues. For example, we conduct a regular congressional policy briefing series on Capitol Hill, and the idea is to inform senior staffers on Capitol Hill about different issues. It's really our commitment not just to educate our students. Obviously, we at Georgetown are in the business of educating students, but we see our mission as a broader mission, and it is about responsibly educating the broader society at large. So we hope to continue doing that. And the Georgetown Center for Financial Markets and Policy has really existed only for 4 years, and it has become the go-to place. And we have the ability to convene people from all sectors of society, from business, from policy, academia, whenever important issues need to be discussed, like the financial market structure issues we're going to be discussing today. We get very strong participation, as you'll see throughout the day, from the SEC, CFTC, White House, Treasury, depending on the topic, IMF, World Bank. So I really see Washington as not just the capital of the United States, but for good or for bad, it has become sort of a global financial hub. There is so much coming out of Washington that affects the financial markets and that affects businesses, that there's a lot of attention being paid to what is happening in Washington. And so I hope we'll have a really good discussion today and come out with some good ideas that everybody can use. And we are delighted that Commissioner Dan Gallagher is going to offer opening remarks. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Professor Sandeep Dahiya, to introduce Commissioner Gallagher. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to this conference on financial markets quality. My name is Sandeep Dahiya. I am an associate professor of finance and stock comp research fellow here at Georgetown University. And it is my honor to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Daniel Gallagher. Commissioner Gallagher was appointed to the commissioner in 2011, but he has had a long and illustrious career both in private as well as public sector. In his earlier stint with SEC, he was the Deputy Director for the Division of Markets and Trading and helped shape SEC's response to the 2008 crisis. Of all the achievements, the one that I would like to highlight is Commissioner Gallagher is a graduate of Georgetown, and we are very, very honored and delighted to have him back at the Hilltop. So without his help, the center would be poorer. He's been very generous in helping the center. He has spoken at numerous events. So I also wanted to thank his generosity for helping the center. And at this point, I would like to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dahiya. That was a very nice introduction. It's always good to be back on the Hilltop and not have to take classes. Or as my wife would point out, a fellow Georgetown alum skipped classes, which is not a condition unique to me. This is a great room. Last year, I was thrilled to be for the first time in the new business school building, but of course, down in the auditorium, the one memory I have of it was craning my neck upwards, given the pitch of the seating there. So this is terrific that you have all these venues. So, in recent months, some have questioned the fairness and, by extension, the quality of the U.S. stock markets. We've heard high-profile allegations that our equity markets are rigged from a particular author who I don't need to name. That author has also argued that the U.S. stock market is now a class system rooted in speed of haves and have-nots. The haves, he says, paid for nanoseconds. The have-nots had no idea that a nanosecond had value. Now, it's true that technology today plays a far more critical role in the equity markets than ever. That technology, however, on the whole, benefits investors far more than it harms them. In fact, investors are doing better in today's marketplace than they ever did when the trading was dominated by manual markets. Research and empirical data demonstrate a number of benefits arising from the introduction of new technology, including lower transaction costs, improved liquidity, greater market speed, more efficient price discovery, reduced volatility, and increased market access. I'm concerned, however, that the current market structure for fixed income products, which is marked by a troubling asymmetry of information, is far more likely to disadvantage investors, retail ones in particular. In the spirit of improving all of our financial markets, therefore, I'd like to take the opportunity this morning to discuss the need for analysis and reforms in both the equities and the fixed income markets. Although the allegations of broken or rigged equities markets are overwrought, the fact is that the laws and rules that the SEC uses to oversee those markets have failed to evolve to match their current operations. The regulations governing our equities markets are derived in large part from the authorities granted to and mandates imposed upon the Commission as part of the Securities Act amendments of 1975. No one doubts that the equity markets of the 1970s are vastly different from the equity markets today. In 1975, you'll recall, The New York Stock Exchange dominated the market. Today, there are 11 exchanges which trade equities. Just as importantly, there are also more than 80 alternative trading systems registered with the SEC, over 40 of which trade equities. On both exchanges and ATSs, the overwhelming majority of transactions are executed electronically. As I've noted in the past, today's equity markets are all but unrecognizable from those of 1975. I see a nodding head down there, Professor Angel. It's been 2 years since I first stressed the need for the Commission to undertake a holistic review of our equity market structure. And since that time, I'm pleased to note that I've been joined in this call by all of my fellow commissioners. In June, Chair White announced that the SEC would commence such a review and outlined several proposals, including some discrete near-term initiatives. It is important that we begin the holistic review in earnest ASAP. Markets and market participants want and need clarity, and more important, investors deserve it. As we conduct our holistic review of equity market structure, we must not get mired down by any one-off issues, as so often happens in this type of situation. We need the Commission and its expert staff to reoccupy the market structure playing field. And in doing so, we must not lose the proverbial forest for the trees. We need a comprehensive review of market structure as it exists today, with a particular focus on the laws and regulations that underlie that structure. We shouldn't pursue, as the government so often does, the bureaucratically satisfying, yet intellectually lazy approach of assuming that the markets and market participants are the source of any perceived problems. We need instead to acknowledge and review the role that regulation has played in creating those problems. As I've said before, there can and should be no sacred cows in our holistic review. In performing such a review, we should not limit ourselves to formulating recommendations for discrete amendments to existing rules or proposals for new ones. We should also conduct a global review of our rules and the statutory framework with the goal of eliminating regulatory overlap and redundancies and providing a level playing field for markets and market participants. Part of the SEC's mission, I'll remind you, is to maintain efficient markets. Markets cannot operate with full efficiency, much less thrive, when they are choked by burdensome and dated regulation. I'd like to focus today on 3 big picture items that our holistic equity market structure review should include: regulation NMS, the self-regulatory organization model, and securities information processors, all parts of our regulatory landscape derived from the 1975 amendments. To begin, it's well past time to place Reg NMS under a microscope and analyze the underlying assumptions that led the Commission, in a contested 3-2 vote, all too familiar these days, to adopt it, as well as the unintended consequences that have arisen from its implementation. My predecessors, Commissioners Glassman and Atkins, dissented from the adoption of Reg NMS because they didn't believe that the Commission adhered to the goal of Congress to allow competitive forces, rather than burdensome regulation, to guide the development of a national market system. Instead, Commissioners Atkins and Glassman argued that the majority adopted Reg NMS based on unfounded assumptions about how the markets and investors should interact. Rather than allowing market forces to develop the national market system, they asserted, Reg NMS was a series of unnecessarily complex, non-market-based rules. A prime example of one of the many elements of Reg NMS that should be subjected to a thorough de novo review is the so-called trade-through rule, which requires trading centers to establish, maintain, and enforce written policies and procedures reasonably designed to prevent the execution of trades at prices inferior to protected quotations displayed by other trading centers. In other words, rather than allowing markets to compete for order flow, the trade-through rule requires orders to be routed to an SRO that displays the national best bid or offer. I believe that the trade-through rule is a prime example of a regulatory distortion of market competition. This SEC mandate effectively acts as a government-sponsored lifeline to markets that would not otherwise be competitive. An alternative to the trade-through rule, wisely recommended by Commissioners Atkins and Glassman, would be to clarify the broker's duty of best execution, which does not always mean execution at the national best bid or offer. It's important to note that FINRA's best execution rule identifies 5 factors in addition to price that must be considered: the character of the market for the security, the size and type of the transaction, the number of markets checked, the accessibility of the quotation, and the terms and conditions of the order as communicated to the firm. It's worth emphasizing that the dialogue surrounding market structure must include a discussion of broker-dealer duties as well. Since the flash crash of 2010, the Commission has focused on the responsibilities of exchanges to ensure execution quality without recognizing the role played by broker-dealers and their best execution obligations. As we do focus on exchange responsibilities, however, and as I've stated many times before, the SRO model needs to be reviewed. We need to revisit the fundamental question of whether or not national securities exchanges should be SROs. SROs serve a vital function in our regulatory oversight paradigm. However, given that the majority of the equities exchanges outsource their regulatory obligations and market surveillance to FINRA, we have to re-examine the very meaning of a self-regulatory organization. In addition, we need to address the fact that over 35% of securities transactions today are affected not on exchange platforms, but rather through ATSs. This matters because exchanges designated as SROs are, among other things, subject to rules and restrictions that do not apply to ATSs. For example, they face ownership limitations and must file any proposed rule change with the SEC for notice and comment, and in some cases, a substantial review through the formal and sometimes lengthy 19B process. An ATS, on the other hand, faces no such ownership restrictions and is required only to file an amendment to their Form ATS at least 20 calendar days prior to implementing material change. This dichotomy risks making ATSs nimbler and better equipped to make quick adjustments to their operations than exchanges, unintentionally putting the latter at a disadvantage. Therefore, a holistic review of equity market structure must explore difficult questions with respect to SROs, such as, what is the appropriate balance of regulatory oversight between the government and by market participants themselves? Does it still make sense to distinguish between national securities exchanges and ATSs? Should we distinguish between exchanges that list securities and those that do not? Should SROs continue to enjoy immunity based on their historical quasi-governmental status? These are difficult questions that I believe must be considered in the course of any holistic market structure review. And as a side note, I'll note that there's been a lot of chatter over the past several years about the presumed inherent conflict of interest posed by the evolution of securities exchanges into for-profit public companies. This concern rests, however, on an unfounded, nostalgic view of the good old days. Remember those days of opaque, private exchange memberships featuring specialists trading in eighths and getting a privileged look at the order flow? This rose-colored view of the past ignores the downsides and inefficiencies of the old system as well as the very real benefits that are the result of the conversion of securities exchanges to public companies, which has provided a much-needed layer of transparency into an incredibly complicated and evolving business model. Nothing akin to this transparency, I'll note, exists for dark venues. Moving from one acronym to another, Securities Information Processors, or SIPs, also deserve a close look. According to the legislative history of the 1975 amendments, a SIP, which consolidates and disseminates market data, is a public utility that should be regulated accordingly. Importantly, the Senate report on that legislation stated that an exclusive central information processor, and I'll quote, shouldn't be under the control or domination of any particular market center. As noted by one academic, this language implies Congress's preference for competing last sale and quotation intermarket reporting services. Today, there are two exclusive primary information processors, one for consolidated transaction data and consolidated quote data, the other for transactions executed pursuant to unlisted trading privileges. Each SIP is currently owned and operated by an affiliate or subsidiary of a major exchange. Although all of the equities exchanges are participants in Reg NMS plans that govern the SIPs, there is no competition for consolidated last sale and quotation reporting services between the SIPs. The market, however, has provided its own solution to the lack of competition. Market participants can purchase the top-of-book data directly from exchanges through their proprietary feeds. The direct feeds provide real-time transaction data for a given exchange, in contrast to SIPs, which consolidate transaction data from all exchanges before dissemination. The result of this consolidation process means that the SIP data lags behind the direct feeds. And, as is the case with most utilities, reliance on SIPs results in a single point of failure. As we saw in August 2013, when a failure in the NASDAQ SIP led to the suspension of trading in all NASDAQ securities, a disruption to the SIP feed can have significant negative effects. Unlike the utility processors, providers of direct feeds have every incentive to innovate, to keep up with competition, and constantly improve their technology. And moreover, there's no single point of failure risk that occurs with direct feeds. Consequently, we must reconsider whether it is appropriate to continue to rely on the utility model, a relic of a mid-70s congressional infatuation with utilities, with its built-in delays and potentially catastrophic crashes. Instead, we should consider the advantages of a market approach that enables market participants to decide which data feeds to utilize and require corresponding disclosure as appropriate. As part of this approach, we could mandate that the exchanges make their direct feeds available for a fee to third-party data vendors who can then aggregate the last sale prices. This could facilitate market competition for consolidated data. In addition to confronting these difficult questions with respect to equity market structure, we need to increase our focus on fixed income markets. And I'll begin by noting a bitter irony. Despite, or perhaps because of, the intense focus that the Fed-dominated Financial Stability Oversight Council has played on identifying so-called systemically important financial institutions, as my old boss Paul Atkins calls them, sci-fis, such as MetLife, the members of FSOC seem oblivious to an actual systemic risk percolating right under their noses, the risk building in the critically important fixed income markets. While FSOC is obsessing with regulating Snoopy and the rest of the Peanuts gang, there are big dollar issues at stake in the fixed income markets. An even greater irony is that this systemic risk is a direct result of the Fed's interest rate and QE policies. Debt financing is a critically important part of the U.S. capital markets. It plays a central role in the operation and stability of both our public and private sectors. Municipal bonds, of which there are over 3.7 trillion outstanding, allow state and local governments to finance their infrastructure projects. Long-term municipal bond sales for August alone totaled $24.4 billion, a 7% increase from August of last year. The corporate bond markets enable companies to operate and grow their businesses through capital investments. There is over $11.3 trillion outstanding today in the corporate debt market. And U.S. bond issuances totaling nearly $1 trillion a year are at an all-time high. The average daily trading volume for fixed income securities of all kinds in July of this year was $670 billion. Retail participation in the municipal and corporate bond markets is very high, 72% in the municipal markets and 46% in the corporate markets. And yet these markets are incredibly opaque to retail investors. It's no secret what is driving investors into these markets, despite their opaque nature: the search for yield arising from over 6 years of near-zero interest rates set by the Fed. Demand for fixed income investments has grown far faster than that for equities. Meanwhile, the spreads to treasuries have continued to narrow. This makes the fixed income markets, and in particular high-yield debt, vulnerable to outflows with only a small increase in interest rates. Just look at what happened last summer in 2013 when the Dow tumbled over 200 points after former Fed Chairman Bernanke simply hinted at the possibility of a rate hike. Yet the Fed is under increasing pressure from inflationary hawks to start raising rates or risk having inflation veer out of control. Their critics, the doves, worry more about a still subpar employment market. The real concern, however, is that if the Fed is underestimating inflation risks, it could be forced to rapidly raise interest rates without allowing the market time to adjust. This would wreak havoc on the debt markets. And while we have record issuances in corporate bonds, the dealer inventory and liquidity in the secondary markets has dramatically decreased. Bond market participants are rightfully afraid that when rates rise, the ability to exit the market will be far more restricted than in the past. Historically, dealers have dominated market making in the secondary corporate bond market, using substantial portions of their balance sheets to provide liquidity. Dealers acted as buffers, absorbing the bonds that investors wanted to sell and holding the inventory until an appropriate buyer could be found. That's no longer the case today. Given enhanced risk management and regulatory constraints, most notably the Volcker Rule and Basel III, dealer inventories of corporate bonds have dropped nearly 75% between 2008 and 2013. Consequently, there is significant risk that when the Fed starts to hike interest rates, outflows from high-yielding, less liquid debt could lead to a free fall in prices. Now that I have sufficiently scared you with doom and gloom scenarios facing the bond markets, let's discuss what the SEC can do about it. For the past several years, banking regulators and others have attempted to graft their systemic risk mandate onto the SEC's own, or otherwise dragoon the agency into the already broad group of systemic risk regulators. This is as unwise as it is impractical. That being said, I believe that by faithfully carrying out our mandate to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation in the fixed income markets, we can address some of the underlying systemic risk arising in those markets. In particular, I believe that the SEC, as the primary regulator of the fixed income markets for non-government instruments, can address the opacity of these markets by requiring greater price transparency. Additionally, we can address liquidity risks by facilitating electronic dealer-to-dealer and on-exchange transactions of these products. Such changes in the secondary market can only happen, however, if the Commission commits the necessary resources to incentivize standardized primary offerings. Currently, most corporate bonds are highly differential and bespoke. In order to facilitate electronic and on-exchange transactions, some degree of standardization of these products will be necessary. The Commission must take the lead on this issue, but it is incumbent upon the industry to find an efficient and expedient path forward. For example, perhaps issuers could agree upon a standard set of terms for debt contracts, something akin to the ISDA contract for swaps. The exchanges and dealer community also need to participate in this discussion by providing in-the-weeds input on what rule changes may be needed to facilitate electronic debt trading. The Commission, for its part, should proactively analyze its rulebook to eliminate impediments, for example, the relevant CorpFin registration requirements. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that the Commission needs to do something about the de facto monopoly forcing the use of CUSIPs in the fixed income markets, starting with removing references to CUSIPs from our rules. I'll not pretend that migrating fixed income transactions from the OTC markets is a small task. However, I'll note that in the early part of the 20th century, there was an active market in corporate and municipal bonds on the New York Stock Exchange. I believe the Commission should engage investors in the industry on this issue and review its rules and regulations to determine a path forward. If we fail to come together to determine this path, we risk a disastrous liquidity crunch and the attendant negative impacts on our economy. And it isn't a stretch to think that Congress could respond to such a crisis by mandating that all corporate bonds be executed on exchange platforms, such as they did for swaps in the ham-fisted Title VII of Dodd-Frank. And the SEC, together with FINRA and the MSRB, must also come together to educate retail investors about these products and their corresponding costs. For price transparency is a hallmark of fair and efficient markets. I'm pleased to report that the MSRB recently approved proposals to enhance disclosure of pricing information for retail investors and expand the availability of pre- and post-trade data on the EMA website. It's clear that tough reforms are needed in the fixed income markets, and to accomplish them, the Commission must be serious about allocating resources. Our Office of Market Supervision in the Division of Trading and Markets employs over 100 staffers devoted to the oversight of the equity and options markets. By contrast, our Office of Municipal Securities is comprised of just 6 employees. Even more striking is the fact that we have no, count them 0, staff focused exclusively on the corporate bond markets. We must allocate resources within the Commission to appropriately deal with the risks in the fixed income markets. It's time to address liar's poker. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today, and I hope that you have a productive and enjoyable conference.
Thank you, Commissioner Gallagher. We have time for a few questions, so if you take a few. We'll pass that.
If you raise your hand, we'll bring the mic to you.
In terms of holistic market review, it seemed like the table was set about 4 years ago with the concept release. Since that time, there was a flash crash in Dodd-Frank that, at least the sense I always got, was delaying that review. Do you see any hurdles at this stage to proceeding with the holistic market review?
So I'll address the predicate first. I personally don't believe that the concept release was the beginning of a comprehensive review. I know what it purports to be on its face, but to me, and that's why I emphasize time and again when I discuss the holistic review, the need to take a hard look at our own rules and, in fact, the statutes that underlie those rules. I don't think the concept release did that. I think it was nipping around the edges of the rules. And in part, it's unfortunate that Reg NMS, for some, has become sacrosanct. It's as if it's written on stone tablets and sitting on the 7th floor of the SEC building, and it can't be. It was a major transformational rulemaking, and we should be analyzing the impact of it on our markets and making changes if necessary. And so I don't think a serious review starts until you start looking at your own cooking, and I don't think that that document did it. Now, putting that aside, I agree with what you said. The flash crash and other things have put us in reactionary mode and put us on our heels. And I think because of that, we've seen a series of what I call the bubblegum and Band-Aid measures meant to address one thing here or there. I think we have more circuit breakers in our markets than we have trading volume at this point. Single stock circuit breaker, short sale circuit breaker, stub quote limitations and things like that. So I think that's actually problematic. It feels good at the time and it responds to some of the CNBC cries for action, but none of those efforts, I think, had been fully vetted at the time, and we haven't done enough to look at the impact. So in good news, and that's why I specifically quoted the chairman's speech of June, I do think the table is set to get the full-on equity market structure review going. I mentioned the discrete proposals that the chairman laid out, some FINRA-type things, the Market Structure Advisory Committee. Those are maybe important. They may be useful and worthwhile for us, but we really need to get going on the bigger review. I've heard it from everyone. I'm frustrated myself. We have to get this going. And what form it's going to take, maybe you can get that guy on the next panel to tell you. It's still up in the air to me. I know how I would do it, but alas, I'm just one commissioner. But I think it's going to happen.
Commissioner, you partially answered this question already in this response, but you mentioned that all 5 commissioners have asked for holistic market structure review, and you've laid out very clearly what you think that should entail. Do you think the other commissioners have the same thing in mind when they talk about holistic market structure review?
Oh yeah, I forgot to give my standard disclaimer, which is usually pretty obvious that my views are my own. And you just go look at my dissent record, you'll see that that's pretty obvious. I don't know. I think there's been some encouraging signs. I think a year ago, about this time, Commissioner Aguilar gave a speech in which he said that it's time to rethink Reg NMS. Has it resulted in fractured markets? Let's tee it up, which I just thought was terrific because this is not a political issue. People like to politicize everything that happens at the commission these days, and just because a Republican commissioner says this, it doesn't mean that we all don't agree that there are issues in the markets. And I was just thrilled with his comments to see, that he too wanted to look at the rule book. I think the chairman's speech in June, it requires a little bit of criminology, but you can kind of read into it that we need to think of some NMS issues also, and Commissioner Pivovar has been out there too. So I think there's just a growing sentiment. Everyone's going to have their own view of things, but I do think that if you approach this the way I do, which I'm starting to try to fill in some of my own thinking on it, but I don't arrive at this with any predetermined outcomes, which I think all of us have to. I think the one thing we should be striving for, as I said in the speech, is a level playing field. That should be it. How you get there, what you need to do it, we should all be open-minded as we approach it, and I think everybody is. No, not Angel.
I just wanted to say really, really great remarks. I agree with everything you said, which is rare for me, for any speech. But can you go into more detail about what process you see this holistic review taking?
Yeah, and I can't, unfortunately, Jim. It's just, it's up to the chairman. The chairman sets the agenda. The chairman can resource the staff in a certain way. I'd have my own way of approaching it, but that might differ from her. So I don't even want to guess right now. I think we're still trying to get our arms around some of these low-lying fruit issues she mentioned in her speech, and then get a little bit of consensus from the commission about how we should kick it off. If it were me, I've said this before publicly, I would have already started, and I also would have done it with probably 3 days worth of public hearings where we dragged everybody down a la 1932 and set a predicate record from which we could proceed with all sorts of issues, whether it be posting white papers as we do on the Midas website now for reaction, concept releases, whether it's proposed rules, whether it's a letter to Congress, fixes, which I think are inevitable. I don't know what it's going to take. It can't be just roundtables and the like, with no action plan behind it. So, still a jump ball. Sorry to give you a non-answer, but it's all I know at this point. And thanks for agreeing.
Given your thoughts on the review and the particularly on the SROs, do you see any impact on the Consolidated Audit Trail CAT initiative underway and potential delays as a result of that, and any conflicts of interest for the fact that the SROs are the consortium that would be the eventual client for this?
I think they have to run wholly separately, the review of the SRO structure and the CAT process. The CAT process itself has been fraught with problems and delays and the like that I know are frustrating a number of people, myself included. I think it's going to be worth the wait, so I'm trying to be patient about it. Any change, just to be clear, any change to the SRO structure, I believe, unless the General Counsel's office gets super creative with the use of exemptive authority, will require legislation for Congress. So if you look at that normal process, it's not going to happen anytime soon, and it should be a very deliberate process, right? Section 6 of the Exchange Act is 80 years old. You don't want to go in and monkey with this stuff every time. The markets change a bit. So I think when we do it, we should do it to set the stage for the markets of the future as well as those today. So I don't see the conflict. I think CAT has to proceed full steam ahead, and it will, and we'll get the plan in here, I guess, by the end of this year, and we'll see how that goes. But eventually it will impact it, just not now in the near term. Oh, sorry.
Commissioner, the opacity of the institutional investor in the corporate bond market is a big source of potential systemic risk. I wonder what is the SEC has taken any action in monitoring the institutional investor in the corporate bond market, and what is your tentative plan of the SEC? Thank you.
It's a great question. I've been, as you can tell, given my remarks, very concerned about the liquidity cliff that we inevitably face. We've had $1 trillion plus issuances for the last 5 years. We're at $1 trillion, I think, this month for this year. Everybody thinks the Fed's going to raise rates, so they're going to get all the offerings done this year. And it's just simple math, which is good because that's all I can handle, as any Georgetown professor will tell you. You have all of these record issuances. You have $11.3 trillion outstanding. Rates go up, bond values go down. People want to sell. Who's going to buy, right? If you can hold to maturity, you're fine, right? But if you have to sell, especially the retail investor, I'm more worried about them than institutional investors. Who are they going to sell to? Well, the dealer inventories are down, right? The rules aren't even implemented yet. Volcker and other rules that will further constrain liquidity. What's going to happen? And so I've been tinkering around on this issue, trying to get some statistics. I thought the vast majority of these issuances were going right into the big asset managers. And even those, right? PIMCO's not going to trade with Fidelity if it's a directional trade. You got to find some liquidity somewhere. One thing I've learned along the way that's, I think, disturbing is that there is a significant portion of ownership by sovereign wealth funds of corporate debt, which adds a new twist to an existing concern in that if you assume rational investor behavior, even in a time of strained liquidity, the rational decision might be just to hold your positions, right? If you can afford to, you hold your position. Sovereign wealth funds might not act rationally, and I think that's a real concern. So unfortunately, the SEC hasn't done much of anything on this issue. I think sizing it is something we can do. We can get information from the asset managers. We can get information from the dealers. FSOC, of course, would be necessary in many ways in the Office of Financial Research to size these things, because a lot of another trend that disturbs me is the moving of inventories within a bank holding company into the bank subsidiary, out of the dealer into the bank, and so we lose sight of it and it's hard for us to get that information. And so we would need bank regulators to get involved to truly size this. But it's a huge risk. I make the joke about liar's poker because 35 years after that book, which decried the fixed income markets, we've done nothing. We don't even have a full-time employee, and it's just way past time that we get there. And the efforts, some of which I just, by example, outlined today, can really, I think, do real work to address the liquidity crunch that we're inevitably going to face. I think that's the last question, guys. Have a great conference, and thanks for having me.